Do you want to be able to make beautiful, industry-standard, professional quality 3D graphics? So do I. But if you want to make shit like what you're seeing on screen here, stick around, because I'm going to show you how. Quick context, I'm no professional. I started doing 3D in 2010, a couple years before I even got actual internet access, so I got used to just figuring things out myself. Here's the beautiful part. I don't actually know that much, which means it's really easy to boil down everything I've learned that lets me make things like this into a few simple, actionable practices that are easy to wrap your head around, and today I want to share all of this experience for anyone who's struggling with 3D graphics. And just to be very clear, if you're looking for all the technically correct industry standard methods and techniques, you won't find them here. If you want to know how you could do everything wrong, cut corners, and still get a compelling and convincing final result, even at a low skill level, stick around, because we're going to learn you something today. So this won't be a step-by-step tutorial, but a software-agnostic set of tips and tricks, as well as simple, actionable best practices that you could recreate in any software of your choice. And one final quick disclaimer, the Mac I'm making today wasn't made for this video. I was making it to use as textures in a horror game I'm making. As such, I'm going to make a lot of mistakes. There are going to be a lot of cut corners and inaccuracies. I decided afterwards to make this video to show off the real behind-the-scenes process with this kind of thing and all of the problems that come with it. Alright, let's get into it. First things first, let's talk fundamentals. If you're already familiar with the basic mechanics of 3D modeling, go ahead and skip to this time, but I think you still might gain something from sticking around for this. So as you hopefully know, 3D models are basically just an assembly of 2D shapes folded around into a 3D object. The specific way you arrange and organize these shapes is called topology. Topology as a whole is both far more important and far more complex than you may think when you're just starting off. I see lots of brand new 3D artists making the same mistake that I used to, and just treating it like an afterthought. But if you want to get good, this is make or break. I say this from experience, and it's a lesson that I've only recently been learning myself. And these are habits that you really want to start building early if you want to save yourself a lot of headache. Case in point, this Mac 10. First real 3D work I've done in years, and it's a pretty simple object, so I figured I can get lazy with the topology and just slap it with loops. Here's how that worked out. Moral of the story, localize your topology. Before you even start detailing, add some fairly square, evenly spaced topology across your mesh. You can do this with loops, subdivision, or many other methods. Either way, the result should look vaguely like this. This lets you just expand off existing topology to add details without affecting other areas of the mesh, and is vital if you want to make something with any sort of compound shapes and not tear your hair out doing it. Now there is a time and place for the old Swift loop method. Simpler shapes without many fine details can be made this way without trouble, but as things start getting more complicated, it's going to turn into a nightmare very fast. Two other things to bear in mind with topology are edge flow and shapes. Edge flow, once again, can get very complex and there's a lot to consider, but to put it as simply as possible, try to make sure your edges follow the shape of your object. You can look into more details on your own time. And by shapes, I mean the shape of the polygons. In general, you want to keep this as quads, since they're the easiest to work with, and they're also the only shape that'll consistently subdivide nicely. There is a time and place for tris, triangles, and n-gons, a shape with 5 or more sides. Particularly on flat surfaces, these are usually fine, but be cautious. If you don't have any loops or supporting topology, a flat surface may not stay flat once subdivided, and in that case, tris and n-gons can become a problem fast. Something else to note, particularly with n-gons, but also quads, it's important to consider that polygons, regardless of their shape, are generally treated internally as tris, and most game engines will automatically triangulate meshes. What this means is be conscious of how your shapes are going to triangulate, especially if you're using any sort of concave polygon, because this can cause a lot of problems if you don't. One specific example of good and bad topology is spheres. When you make a sphere in most 3D software, you usually get something that looks like this. What you may not realize is, usually, you really don't want to use this. See how the topology is very sparse around the equator, but very, very dense near the poles, and also how the loops terminate in tris? These really aren't ideal. They make the shape a lot harder to work with, and it also causes smoothing problems with subdivision. So some software has an option for a different type of sphere, often with different names. I use 3ds Max, which doesn't as far as I know. Either way, you can make your own by subdividing and spherifying a cube. As you can see, this sphere has fairly evenly sized and spaced polygons, and it's all quads. Now this all being said, there are some more advanced modeling techniques that use n-gons in some pretty wild ways. Those are way beyond my understanding, and if you're still watching this, probably beyond yours as well. So for hard surface modeling, I usually like to tackle it in 3 steps. First, I make the base mesh. For this, I'll include any large-scale details that are going to be featured in the actual model. It doesn't need any of the fine details that are going to be baked into the texture map, but it's important to keep the topology as clean as possible at this stage to save yourself a lot of work later. Depending on what I'm making, I'll usually stick a reference image in the background for this part. I'll basically trace over it to get the silhouette right. Make sure that you really nail down the silhouette in this stage because it'll be a big pain in the ass to change later. One more tip, if you're having trouble making something, break it down into smaller, simpler shapes. Putting together a simple block out of an object can help here. How close can you get using only simple primitives? Something else that a lot of less experienced 3D artists don't tend to think much about is how things were manufactured. Looking at the Mac 10 in particular, you can see that almost every piece was made using stamped sheet metal. Basically, most parts were just a flat, thin piece of metal that was die cut and folded into shape. So if, for example, I modeled the lower receiver like this, it would make a final result that technically looks fine, but isn't convincing and doesn't sell that this is an actual object that physically exists, which is the end goal with this kind of thing. Instead, I got much better results from starting with a flat surface, folding it around the upper, and then extruding it. It's still completely inaccurate to an actual Mac 10, but it sells the look that this is a flat piece of metal that's been cut and folded into a box. Additionally, it's a good idea to start thinking about how different parts are attached to each other. The lower receiver here is a completely separate part from the upper. A lot of newer artists may have simply combined them together into a single mesh, but that can make things start blending together and look like it's all one piece. So what I did here, for instance, is add a slight bevel to the inside edge of the lower to create an actual seam between the two. And that really helps communicate that these are two separate pieces. Put the same level of thinking into every piece of what you're making, whether it's injection molded plastic, CNC milled billet steel, whether things are riveted or friction fit, welded, because this is going to become increasingly important as we move into the high poly mesh and texturing. So when your base mesh is done, it should look something like this. Again, this model is far from perfect. I cut a lot of corners with the topology in areas like the grip because it's a simple object and I can get away with it. And that's another point I really want to hammer home here. In general, there's a right way and a wrong way of doing things. Despite what a lot of people may think, doing things the wrong way does not lock you out of a good final result. Do the best you can do, but don't obsess over details like this. Try to learn as you go, always strive to do better, pick up good habits and best practices on the way, but know how to prioritize. So there's something I've gained a lot of over the course of 15 years smacking my head into the wall figuring this out for myself, that even professionals often lack. And that's perspective of what actually matters to get a good looking final product. A lot of people, far more skilled in 3D than I will ever hope to be, spend a lot of effort obsessing over the right way of doing things, and they're not wrong either. There's a reason it's considered the right way of doing things. But the thing is, when you're just starting off, these are things that are going to take a lot of time and effort to get proficient with, but can be easily worked around without hurting the final result. And for inexperienced artists that would be happy just to make something that looks like this or this, it's not just a waste of time at that stage, but actively distracts from what's actually important. So if you're making a mesh, and you've got some topology that looks like this, or this, most educated artists will tell you that's bad. And they're right. Never forget that, and always push yourself to learn the right way as you go. But never be afraid to tell them to shove it, because it works for you right now and gets a fine-looking final result. Next step is making the high poly. For me, this is the fun part of modeling, because it's the most creative and also the least technical. The point of this step is to create a new mesh with all the little details we're going to need to make the textures by whatever means necessary. And this is where giving your base mesh clean topology really starts to pay off. If you kept an even distribution of polygons, good edge flow and loops, localized your topology, and paid attention to the way materials are manufactured, it could be a very quick and trivially easy step in the process. But if you didn't, it could be a nightmarish endeavor. So there's a few different common methods for this process, but there's two that I tend to use in tandem to get the final result I want. The first is subdivision. Technically, subdivision just splits every quad into 4 quarters, and that's why things start getting a little bit weird with tris or n-gons. It'll also generally smooth out your mesh. Depending on your software, you might need to use differently named functions for it, like Turbo Smooth in 3ds Max. This will round out any hard edges on a mesh, but how it smooths is based on your topology. Think about it this way. It splits each quad into 4, then averages out the surface direction, smoothing out those 4 polygons. If you want to get a harder edge, add some topology along the edge for it to smooth between. The harder you want the edge, the tighter you keep that topology. So it's important not to go overboard and over smooth your mesh, but remember to exaggerate a bit, because the very fine bevels won't come across in textures. Which leads us to our next point. Oftentimes, objects will have very fine details that just don't make sense to include in the base, low-poly 3D model. Things like engravings, rivets, stuff of that nature. When you're making the decision of whether to include something in the base mesh or keep it exclusive to the high poly or texture, you have to consider a few things. Firstly, keep in mind, however 3D a normal map may look, it's completely flat. More on this later. So if something sticks out or into a surface far enough to meaningfully affect the silhouette, include it in the base mesh. Especially if it's something that'll be frequently viewed from grazing angles like this, because that's where the fake depth really starts to fall apart. But even in areas where the added detail has minimal effect on the silhouette, it may still be a good idea to add some 3D detail just for parallax reasons. You can get away with a lot in these cases, feel free to keep it very simple and basic, but just adding a little bit of 3D depth can help out a lot. And this is one of those things that you can't really just have explained to you and instantly get it. It's going to take some trial and error, and you're just going to have to practice and get a feel for it, but keep it in mind and you'll pick it up quick. Something else to keep in mind though is not every detail has to be added to the high poly mesh. Things like screws, rivets, or welds are best kept on the mesh in my opinion. Text and engravings can go either way depending on the specific circumstance, and microsurface details, stuff like the rough textured plastic here, are best left to textures. I'll be getting into this a little bit more in the texturing section, but in general, don't be afraid to do what feels best for you. If you prefer stamping rivets on in Substance Painter, I won't stop you. But whatever way you choose to do these details, there is a few things you gotta keep in mind. Firstly is how a normal map works. So for context, a normal map is often referred to as a bump map, which is a misnomer. But this is what we use to fake the high poly detail on a low poly mesh. Newer artists tend to have a hard time understanding how these work, and they can be very confusing at a glance, but how they work is actually really simple. The blue channel shows how much something is facing forward, white is facing directly at you, black would be facing directly backwards. The green channel shows if something's facing up or down, and that will vary from software to software. Some of them have green pointing up, some of them have green pointing down. And then red shows left to right. Notice that it doesn't hold any height information, only direction. Meaning if we extrude something from our mesh directly perpendicular to the surface and don't bevel it a bit, it'll actually just be invisible in the normal map. So even if you're adding a detail that realistically sticks straight in or out, you need to add some sort of bevel for it to be visible. So always keep that in mind when adding details to the high poly that won't be represented in the low poly mesh. Make sure that you add a slight bevel or taper, otherwise they'll just completely vanish when it's time to bake. The high poly mesh is also where it starts getting really important to consider what material your object is made of, how it's manufactured, how it's worn down over time. Sometimes you want to significantly smooth out and round off every hard edge, sometimes you need to keep them crisp and sharp. There are lots of ways that you can add details in this stage, such as Boolean subtraction, and those will vary a bit based on software, but in general, as long as you kept good topology in your base mesh, adding these the old-fashioned way usually is the best way to go about it. Stuff like adding circular indents for screws and rivets is trivial if you have good topology to work with. But once again, don't obsess over this. I spent a long time adding most of these kinds of details with booleans and remeshing. It makes things really hard to work with and almost impossible to backtrack in any meaningful way, but there's nothing that'll stop the final product from still looking good. So do what you can, work around what you can't. One other quick trick for this is to pop a subdivision or two based on smoothing groups, and then another one with regular smoothing. It's a good way to crisp up the smoothed edges a bit without any manual work if things look too soft, on the condition that your topology is decent. Depending on what you're making, it might also be worth taking your high poly mesh through a sculpting pass. This could be a good way to add some of the trickier fine details, as well as rough things up a little bit for more of a lived-in look. For the purposes of the Mac 10, I brought most of the pieces into ZBrush, primarily to add some of the distinct booger welds holding the Mac 10 together, but I also used it to sharpen up some of the edges that needed to be a little bit harder, again considering the actual manufacturing process, as well as adding some dings and dents. If you're adding wear and tear like this, once again, it's a fine balance where you have to exaggerate a bit, but be careful not to go overboard. Once again, this is something that you're just going to have to get a feel for as you go. But it's really valuable at this stage to consider the finer details of things. What kind of damage would this reasonably accumulate, and where would it be? Things like flattening out these corners a bit, because I can imagine those getting smacked into pretty easily. I also added some flat spots on some of the softer curves and these stamped lines here, particularly the top one, because the lower one is kind of tucked in between the top one and the lower receiver and wouldn't really be that exposed. Because these areas are very rounded and smooth, the impacts would likely be pretty spread out and the force would be distributed over a larger area. And that's why these get gentle flat spots as compared to this corner, which was aggressively smushed in. You're going to be very sick of hearing this by the end of this video, but this is something that you're just going to have to practice and get used to. Try to get in the habit of looking for details like this in real-life objects or even other 3D models. Look for fine details like this, and this part of the process will get exponentially easier as you go. Another case of this was the text. As far as I can tell, it's stamped in. What this means is no material was removed, just pushed out of the way, so the edges around the text will bulge up and ripple, particularly in these acute interior angles where more material was displaced with less room to go, so bulge higher. And in retrospect, I was actually way too conservative with this and should have exaggerated it a lot more than I did because it's barely visible at all on the final mesh. And if you're watching this thinking, what's the point? No one's ever going to notice that, so why are you wasting the effort? Then I'm going to be real with you. That mindset is why you're struggling to make convincing 3D. Again, I'll talk more about this in the texturing section, but 90% of making 3D that looks convincing, like an actual physical object that you can reach out and touch, is things like this. Little details that no one would ever consciously notice. If you can look at your high poly mesh with no textures and already get a good feel for what kind of material it's made of, how it was manufactured, etc., you're going to have a much easier time when we get to texturing. So once you're finished, depending on whether you took it through a sculpting pass or not, and whether you wanted to add texture engravings during the texturing step, your high poly mesh should either look something like this or something like this. It should have no jagged polygons or smoothing issues, all the detail you're going to want in the final product, and at this point, things like poly counts and topology are irrelevant, and can be whatever you need for the mesh to look its best. For example, the high poly sculpted Mac has over 11 million polygons, and topology that looks like this. Some real UE5 spec shit. But as long as it looks perfect, who cares? Time for fun. By that I mean the most boring and tedious part of the process, when you're removing detail and making things worse. But you're so close to texturing a nice finished project, it's easy to get lazy and rush through this part. Which is why I did exactly that for the Mac. I'm also going to be using a few other things that I've made as better examples. The low poly mesh. Here what we're doing is simplifying things as much as possible and removing all excessive details. In general, especially nowadays, this is a very forgiving process, but it's also still easy to screw up. Things like smoothing aren't a big deal here, so first thing we're going to do is get rid of any excess topology and simplify the mesh as much as possible. With the Mac, it would have been good practice to clear out all this excess topology, but because I'm only making it to use as a PS1 style texture, it's never going to be used in game, I don't really care. But what really matters at this stage is silhouette. You can strip out tons of details in the middle of your mesh as long as the low poly silhouette still matches the high poly. Because we're going to be getting to texture baking very soon, and that's where silhouette starts really becoming important and you're going to start paying for any deviations. So there are a couple of tricks you can use for this. I want to note these are mostly just old tricks from when optimization was a lot more important, and something like 10,000 polygons would have been considered as being on the high end for a first-person weapon. The only reason I'm going over this is because optimization is becoming a dying art and I really don't want to feed into that. So firstly, convex details are generally going to be a lot more important than concave details. Again, it's all about silhouette. So for example, on the Mac barrel, I cut the poly count in half everywhere except for the bits that physically stick out, like the tip of the barrel, the threading, and the outer edge of this flat piece. So even though the resolution is cut in half for the rest of it, because it isn't visible in the silhouette, it's basically invisible in the final mesh. Then in the case of these rivets on the front sight, they're small enough details that they could have just been left as textures, but because they're almost exclusively viewed from glancing angles, it can cause some weirdness in the lighting if there's no depth, so they do have some geometry on the low poly, but once again, not visible in the silhouette, so they can safely be stripped down to very low detail with basically no visual impact. Using tricks like this, even with the horrifically unoptimized topology, the final mesh clocks in at around 8,000 quads, bringing it up to about 14,000 polygons when triangulated. Put a half hour into optimizing it, and you could easily cut the try count to under 9,000. For comparison, the Megascans table it's sitting on in this render has over 1 million polygons. Next time you find yourself wondering why modern games eat up 100 plus gigabytes and run like shit, keep that number in mind. Either way, now you've got a nice, optimized, low poly mesh with minimal polygons. What else should you consider? Surface area. I really should have started here because it's way more important, always has been, always will be. In general, textures are by far the most expensive part of a model in terms of storage and VRAM use. You would need millions of polygons before your model starts taking up as much resources as a typical texture set. So more so than reducing the poly count, focus on reducing the surface area in your low poly mesh. To reiterate, I got lazy making this low poly. Do as I say, not as I do. Best practice would have been to combine the plastic and metal parts of the grip into one object, deleting the seam between them, kinda like what I did with the receiver and stock on this M37. Also optimal here would have been combining the grip with the lower and the lower with the upper. This would easily add a couple of thousand polygons if done right, but would absolutely be worth it if you're trying to optimize. The workflow I'm showing you doesn't like overlapping UV maps. They're more than possible, but you're jumping through a whole bunch of hoops to make them happen. As such, any surface area covered by other objects is just wasted texture space, and even cleaning up this much texture resolution would more than make up however many thousands of polygons it took to accomplish. Because the thing with textures is they generally have to exist in powers of 2 for mip mapping purposes. If you don't know what that is, don't worry about it, it's not important. Just know that you basically have to pick a power of 2 for your texture size. Because if you have a 2048 by 2048 texture that's just a little bit too blurry because you wasted a lot of UV real estate with excess surface area, the next step from there would be doubling the resolution to 4096 by 2048. But for that, you would have to repack your UVs into a 2:1 aspect ratio. So if you don't want to have to redo that and keep it square, you're going to have to step up to a 4096 by 4096 texture, which is 4 times the resolution of your 2048 by 2048, and you don't get an in-between. As such, you never want to sacrifice surface area for poly count. Modern engines deal with polygons like nothing, but textures are, and likely always will remain, extremely heavy, so be smart with them. And that leads us into our next step, UV maps. It's a painfully boring process and literally the last thing you do before starting textures, so I get the temptation to rush through. Please don't look at any of my UVs, I always rush. And particularly on a hard surface object, never use auto UVs, I'm begging you. Because with UV maps, there's 3 things you gotta keep in mind: seams, distortion, and textile density. There is no all-in-one solution for any of these things, and it's a game of pros and cons, and it's important that you do these deliberately and with purpose. So before we get in, thank your lucky stars you're learning this in 2025. When I started, I was painting textures by hand in Photoshop, which is how it used to be done. You better hope your UVs are real nice unless you want everything to look like complete dog shit and have a miserable time making it back in those days. In general, seams and distortion are inversely proportional to each other. You want to reduce distortion? Add more seams. Want to clean up your seams? Brace for some distortion. As far as textile density, it's inversely proportional to itself. The higher you make the density for one part, the lower it gets everywhere else, and vice versa. And there's a bunch of different workflows for UV mapping, but the basic principles are the same. The first thing to consider is seam placement. You need seams, it's up to you to find the least noticeable spots for them. Firstly, try putting them on hard corners as much as possible. It's much harder to notice a seam in the texture if there's a hard break in the lighting on that spot already. In particular, try to hide them on corners that you aren't going to see and combine UV islands together as much as possible. On the shorty, I could drop a seam right here on this hard corner, but this was meant to be a first-person weapon, so that's directly in view at all times. Instead, I'll tuck it in down here. Sometimes you don't have a hard corner for your seams. In that case, try to tuck them away in creases or crevices where they'll be tough to see. For something like this, you'd want to tuck the seams in between the barrel and the tube, because in order to see both faces on either side of the seam at the same time, you'd be blocked by the other part, meaning it's nearly impossible to spot even if you're looking right at it. As far as distortion, you can usually shift things around a little bit to try to hide it, but in general, the only cure is adding more seams. It's up to you to decide the balance of how much distortion is too much and when it's worth splitting something up. Now, modern software like Substance Painter is great at hiding seams and distortion, but it'll never be perfect. Such as the Mac. No matter what I did, I could never get rid of this seam completely. Even Substance Painter isn't perfect. And that's why you have to be careful and deliberate with your seam placement. Aside from that, think about textile density as well. Something like the receiver is going to be a big focal point, very visible from a first-person perspective, and has a lot of fine details. So it's generally worth scaling up a bit, and eating up a bit more resolution to make sure it's extra crisp. Less visible or detailed areas, like a stock or the inside of the barrel or magwell, are much less important than the rest of the model, so they can be scaled down a bit to save some resolution for other areas. Finally, after you've got your UVs flattened, it's time to pack them. Don't just auto pack them. I'm lazy, I usually do, I always pay for it. One reason for this is because it's important to consider what direction things are facing. If the textures are low res enough that you could ever see individual pixels, it can still look totally fine as long as they're aligned, but it starts looking pretty weird if things are crooked. Aside from that, it's a quality of life thing for texturing. Say you want a wood grain or brushed metal look on your object, but all the UV islands are pointing in different directions. Congratulations! Enjoy the massive headache you've created for yourself. UVs suck. They're boring, they're tedious, but if you want to make things that look good, you've got to put in some effort and do them right. And there's our low poly made. It really doesn't have to be anything special. I mean, look at the Ithaca with no textures, just the low poly. There's really not much to it. So now it's time to bake your texture maps. This is a very simple step that can be make or break for getting a good final result. Thankfully, once again, this is infinitely easier than it used to be back when I was learning. Baking, in this specific case, is the process of grabbing all of that detail we added to our high poly mesh and squishing it into textures that will stick on our low poly mesh to make it look more detailed than it actually is. There's a million different specific ways this works in various softwares, but it always boils down to the same basic idea. You use a cage to project detail from the high poly down to the low poly. In general, you want the cage as small and close to the low poly as possible, but it has to completely encompass the high poly mesh, and that's really all there is to it. Sometimes you just pick the distance for the cage and call it a day, sometimes you can paint the offset, sometimes you tweak vertices, but it's always the same idea. Small as possible without the high poly poking through. Something else to keep in mind is it's projecting the detail from the cage to the object, so the perspective may not always line up. I don't really know how to explain this verbally, so I'll just show you here. It's because of the angle of raycasting from the cage to the mesh, if that makes sense. It's the only time topology really matters on the low poly, and the fix for something like this would be to add a few vertices around any areas that are giving you trouble. That being said, it seems to be much less of an issue nowadays. Until now, I've used some older software from around 2016 to do my baking. I'm just very stubborn and set in my ways. I refuse to even update software that I have. This Mac was baked in Substance Painter with very little care, expecting an absolute mess, just curious to try it, and it came out fantastic. I don't know what kind of witchcraft is going on in there, but damn. Being said, it's still far from perfect. Look at these corners and edges. They look pretty strange and definitely need some cleanup. Sometimes that just means you need to tweak the cage a bit, but here, in the majority of cases like this, it's a silhouette issue. Yeah, you figured I'd be done talking about silhouettes by now, huh? These are caused by the low poly silhouette sticking out too much from the high poly. To fix this, we just need to tweak the shape and geometry of our low poly to bring it more in line with the high poly. This might mean moving some vertices, beveling edges, or just adding more geometry, but by adjusting the low poly to better match the silhouette of the high poly, just doing that will clean up these issues no problem. It took me embarrassingly long to figure that out, by the way, like almost 10 years. I blamed it on projection artifacting from the cage, which it technically is, and tried changing projection settings and fucking with the cage, but never thought deep enough to realize what I could do with the mesh to mitigate this issue. And one thing you might notice is I spread out all the moving parts. This is called exploding the mesh, and it stops moving parts from leaving behind permanent shadows and artifacts from where they were baked. Absolute bare minimum, you want tangent normals and ambient occlusion. That's all I used for the first few years when I was hand drawing textures, but if you're using software like Substance Painter, Quixel Mixer, or Armor Paint, curvature and cavity maps are also critical. World Normal, ID Map, or Clown Pass, and Position Gradient are all very useful for those as well. But before diving headfirst into texturing, test out your baked maps. Make sure they look right. Throw the normals onto the mesh. I also like to use the curvature and occlusion maps here as well so you can see all three in action. Turn up the gloss to really highlight any shading issues. Now for the fun part, and I mean that for real this time, texturing. Texturing is great because that's where it all comes together and you really start seeing the final product. It's also easily the most important step. I'm gonna be real, it took me 3 years of 3D graphics to learn this, and it's still the #1 mistake I see from people who are new to 3D. People will put in all this effort, spend hours making this really nice, detailed mesh, and then slap a generic texture or smart material on it and call it done in 5 minutes, and have a dog shit final product, walk away feeling like they suck at 3D. Like, brother, you're better at modeling than I've ever been. I wish I could make models like that. You just have the wrong mindset. Make no mistake, this is why we're here. All that work we put into the model is leading to this. The meticulously detailed, carefully sculpted high poly exists solely to bake our base texture maps. The beautifully simplified low poly, painstakingly UV'd by hand to perfection, is just a vessel to wrap our textures around to display them. Everything we've done this entire time so far only matters because it's necessary for the textures. The texture is what this whole thing is for. That's what makes it look real or stylized or whatever you're going for. That's why on the low poly mesh, which is the one that you actually use and see, the only thing that's mattered up until this point is the silhouette. None of the details within that matter because that's all textures. Honestly, if you have 10 hours to put together a nice render, spend 4 on the model, 5 on the textures, and 1 on the lighting and presentation. And one thing I want to get out of the way right now, don't use built-in smart materials. I don't know why, every software I've ever used, they are invariably dogshit. If I had to guess, they were put together by programmers, not artists. Use them as a base if you want to modify and add on to, but never throw one on and call it a day. Even if it looks close to the thing you're trying to pull off, it'll never be a good option for 2 reasons. Number 1, you should make your textures specifically for this object, like with the Mac. Even if I made other objects that I want to be made out of the same materials with the same paint and wear, I wouldn't be able to just use this as a smart material and call it a day. A lot of the detail here uses hand-painted masks to help localize things. Some use specific generators and filters to look a very specific way on a very specific spot on the model, and a lot of it's just straight up hand-painted. Just as with many things in life, a one-size-fits-all solution might kind of sort of work with everything, but it'll never fit quite as good as something in your size specifically. Tailor your textures to your specific project. And reason number 2, they're not subtle enough. Now this might sound like a tangent, but I'll keep it quick, I promise it has a point. I'm currently making a classic-inspired survival horror game called The Revanchist. That's actually what the Mac here is for, I'm gonna crunch it down to PS1 graphics. Now you've probably already noticed, it's a little pixelated. Even the retro-inspired graphics still have a lot of detail sometimes, and it's almost impossible to see all of it. A lot of people don't like it. I don't particularly care. But the most common specific point I hear is, how could you cover up that detail? Or, I can't see all the details. Sometimes, why would you want to cover up all of your hard work? And I always found that really funny. Because what do you think I do anyways? What do you think making convincing, vaguely realistic 3D art actually entails? Here's the Mac 10. Nice clean lighting, front and center, the closest anyone is ever going to be able to look at it. So tell me, how many colors of paint were on it? How many different colors of exposed steel were on it? 3 colors of paint, 7 colors of steel. Pin those numbers in the back of your mind. I'll be talking about them now, but I'll also be circling back later. In order to make convincing 3D, you need more detail than you can see. And by convincing, I mean something that you can convince yourself is real. Not necessarily perfectly realistic, but you can imagine it physically existing, that it would have weight and momentum to it. And to make something look convincingly real, you need that level of detail. And it's not about resolution, but variation. Looking at the paint in particular, at a glance, it's a solid, grayish-green semi-gloss paint. First, I started off with a simple base layer. Then I used 2 of Substance Painter's generators, galvanized metal and rough surface, to add very subtle, almost unnoticeable variation that I'm not even sure is going to survive compression, but make a night and day difference for believability. From there, I added another deeper, darker, more saturated green paint in the cavities and occluded spots. This helps add definition, but also helps sell that the paint is a bit worn. Anything more exposed is slightly dulled and faded. The third paint layer is a bit lighter and has a slight orange tint. This appears around the edges, but is very spread out and soft. Once again, helps with definition, but gives the paint a slightly oxidized yellowing look. They're not easily noticeable at a glance, and that's the point. Having lots of subtle, almost unnoticeable details is, in my opinion, the biggest part of what make textures believable. Just the fact that they're even there means a lot more than whether or not they're realistic. Because the way I figure it, nothing in the world is perfect. There's always some level of discoloration, scratches, or scuffs. Tiny little things that affect the overall look but are too small to ever individually notice. You see them, your brain registers them, but you never actually look close to see what they specifically are. When your brain sees a texture with all these little details that are too subtle to pay enough mind to actually notice, it just says, yeah, looks about right, and moves on. Because if you know anything about graphic art, traditional art, material science, or really anything, you'll know that 7 colors of steel is nothing short of ridiculous in terms of realism, but they add a bit of contrast and variation, and that's what counts. As long as they're not strong enough to be actively distracting, it's all good. Ideally, it would be done in a way that at least suggests realism. The steel may be orange, but it's a subtle orange. Almost looks like it's about to rust. A very thin oxidized layer or something. Again, realistic? Absolutely not. But close enough that if you're not scrutinizing it too much, it's not going to stand out. Hate to pull this one out again, but you're just going to have to get a feel for it. But if you want to learn this fast, keep these 2 things in mind. Number 1, look at mundane objects really close. Consider how it looks, what tiny details come together to make it look that way that you've never really noticed before. Number 2, fuck around and find out. Don't chain yourself to a specific look or obsess with realism. Screw with things. Have fun. Make shit that looks ridiculous. If you're working on something that just isn't working, don't be afraid to scrap it and restart. What you're seeing here is my 3rd attempt at texturing this Mac. Don't waste time on it. I think I spent about 10 minutes on the first attempt, 30 on the next. I realized quick that they weren't working and I didn't waste any more time. Once I found a general look that I liked, I spent about 5 hours dialing it in. Of that 5 hours, I spent about 1 on the base, underlying materials and big details. The other 4 were spent adding these little details and tweaking and tuning. That's just the reality of making convincing 3D. You have to be prepared to accept that the majority of your time is going to be spent on tiny details that most people will never notice for the good of the final product. And if you've been struggling to make convincing textures, it's very often just a case of not putting enough time in for this. Just keep at it. And to anyone wondering why good, realistic-looking 3D art takes so much time to make, this is why. The majority of the time spent is on tiny little things that you're never actually going to notice, and that's by design. But be careful with these things. Realize that people not noticing them isn't optional. If you crank up the strength and contrast of these details until everyone can see all of them so they can appreciate all the hard work and effort you put in, all of a sudden, the effect is gone. When you can see every detail, it loses that realistic quality. The whole point is that the detail is so subtle you're never going to specifically notice it, so it stays in the background, so to speak. Your brain goes, wow, that's a lot of text, too bad I ain't reading it, and just writes the object off as realistic. Trust me, you don't want people noticing and thinking about these things. And the way I'd like to test and tune these details is like this. If I can casually look at the model and clearly notice it right away, it's too strong and needs to be softened. But if I flick the layer on and off, it should be a clear and unmissable difference. If it's not, the layer's probably too soft and probably isn't contributing much. And I really can't stress the importance of this enough. I spent years running in circles trying to figure out what my textures were missing. It was this. I had lots of detail, just as much as my newer work, frankly, but it was all detail that you can really clearly, obviously see. Figure this is also a good chance to circle back to adding things like rivets, welds, and engravings in the texture. Back in the day, I did it by making a height map that I would use endo to convert to normals, curvature, and ambient occlusion maps, and then layer those on top of the base textures. That way, all of our engravings are properly baked into our maps as if it was real geometry, and then it'll react to things like dirt and edge wear appropriately. The way I've seen a lot more people doing it recently is using something like Substance Painter's brushes to just stamp them on. Once again, I won't tell you not to do this, but you're not going to catch me doing it anytime soon. In order to make it look proper and like an actual part of this model as a physical object instead of a fake detail stamped on top, you've got to do a lot more legwork. You've got to add appropriate ambient occlusion into the ambient occlusion map. You've got to manually paint on the surface details, such as the various paint and metal colors on this Mac. And you have to do it in a way that's consistent with the rest of your mesh and texture. I wouldn't doubt I'm missing some sort of better way of doing this, and that there are steps you can take to automate this process, but even if there is, I still see so many people doing it this way. And again, if you take anything away from this video, let it be this. It's okay to cut corners. You just need to be considerate with it. If it's some inconsequential environment art or clutter, go for it. Stamp these things on, save the time for more important things. But if you're making something more substantial like a first-person weapon, which is often the closest an object is ever going to be in the camera and it's plainly visible at basically all times, it really is worth putting in the time and effort to get it right. Now, with all this being said, there's one big elephant in the room, and I'd be remiss if I didn't address it. Because you've probably heard some form of the rhetoric, every game looks the same now, or every Unreal Engine game looks like an Unreal Engine game, or even just generally, new games look worse than games from 10 plus years ago. And not enough people stop to consider why, or understand enough about 3D graphics to actually pinpoint it. And I'll tell you right now why exactly that is. It's realism. What you need to understand is realism as a visual style has very strict rules. Steel looks like steel, with a specific color value and reflectance. Aluminum looks like aluminum. Walnut looks like walnut. Dirt, weathering, wear, it all has to be done in a very specific way. Now, I don't seek out 3D tutorials, but I do get a bunch of them popping up in Reels, and I do like to watch them when I see them. And pretty much anything I ever see about texturing is always, don't do this, don't do that, or whatever, because it's not realistic. And I've got a couple of things to say about that. Because while I'm certainly no pro and my work is still very amateurish, you could probably see that I at least have some grasp of making compelling, vaguely realistic 3D models. And you want me to let you in on a secret? My textures aren't realistic at all. I've already touched on this a little bit with the Mac, but the best example is the Model 37. Let's actually get up close and personal, really analyze the material. First of all, look at all this black grime buildup on the ends of the wood furniture. This is something you might see on a 200-year-old musket, but no shot this shotgun would have wood that looks like this realistically. But it looks cool, it fits the aesthetic I was going for, so I did it. And look at the metal. I've heard of blued steel, but this is ridiculous. I mean, what the hell is this even supposed to be? I don't know, it looks cool. And you remember the orange metal on the Mac? Well, look who's back. But not all the exposed metal, only some of it. I could go on, but my point is, the entire texture from the ground up is entirely unrealistic. But it's a compelling visual, not in spite of its lack of realism, but because of it. I've taken the liberty of pulling up the old project file for this and modified the diffuse map so it's actually realistic. I've changed the color and opacity of some of the layers in the diffuse, but it's the same otherwise, and every other texture, gloss, metalness, etc. has been left untouched. Now, if you can wholeheartedly look at this side by side and say to yourself, the realistic one looks way better, it's far more compelling visual, and that's what I'd rather make, that's fine. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, even if it's wrong. Back when I first started learning 3D, realism wasn't really a thing. We didn't have ray tracing or physically based rendering, so instead of realism, people just focused on making things look good. And that seems to have gotten lost over the years. How many of you have heard someone tell you not to multiply your ambient occlusion into your diffuse because it's not realistic or how light actually behaves? Well, they're right. It isn't realistic. It's not how light actually behaves. Once again, I'll let you be the judge here of which of these you think looks better. But I will put on record that most of the time, I think things look better with a little bit of occlusion in the diffuse. Again, more of an old school trick that used to be a standard practice, because it's a great way to add depth, definition, and clarity, and just make the material look a lot more interesting, but has been abandoned because it's not technically realistic. The point I really want to make here is you don't have to chain yourself to realism, even if you want the final product to pass as realistic. Not one person in 6 years has seen this shotgun and said something along the lines of, "Oh, so you're making a stylized cartoon game then?" It still passes as realistic, even though it's technically absurd. Why is so much of the metal orange? Because it's complementary to the blue finish and adds some contrast. Why is the finish so blue? I like the way it looked with the orangish metal, so I cranked up the saturation. Why is some of the metal not orange? I wanted to break it up and add some variation to the exposed metal. Every decision I made was made on the basis of how can I make this look good and how can I give this object some personality, make it tell a story. Realism didn't even cross my mind. If you can casually look at an object and think, yeah, that kind of looks realistic, that's good enough. So play around with your materials. Try weird color combinations or reflectance. Figure out what works and what doesn't. And always remember the second half of that phrase, figuring out what doesn't. Mistakes are how you learn. Don't be afraid to fuck with things, even if you know it won't work. You could still gain a lot of knowledge just from seeing exactly how it doesn't work. Really quick, one last look at this shotgun. It's terrible. I've gotten so much better technically since I've made this. Look at all the weird baking artifacts and how mushy and blurry the textures are because I didn't prioritize the textile density properly. I couldn't even center the barrel on the receiver properly. Now let's take a quick look at Resident Evil 7, one of the last games I remember people getting really excited about the graphics for. It's a beautiful game, especially for the time it came out. Why don't we check out their shotgun? I can promise you, the guy who made this is far more skilled in 3D than I am or could ever hope to be, and infinitely better than I was back when I made this. But is it just me, or does it look like shit? There's no personality, no definition, it doesn't tell a story, it's a mushy blob of gray. And even though my old Model 37 is awful, I'd personally choose it for my own game 7 days a week and twice on Sunday over this. There's no replacement for creativity in art direction. So many graphic artists today do it because they figured it was a good career for them. They went to school, built their skills, and could model and texture circles around me with ease, using techniques I could only describe as witchcraft. But they did all their learning with textbooks and lectures. They know all the industry standard methods and technically sound workflows and could probably recite the specular value for each common metal by heart, but have no practical experience in making things that actually look good. Never forget that technical 3D graphics production and making a compelling, striking final product are two completely separate skills. You can get good at both eventually, but I suggest making the decision early on which one you want to do first. And this leads me to the final part of production, lighting and presentation. A lot of people also underestimate the power of good lighting and presentation. Just like a good texture can save basically any shitty mesh, good lighting and presentation can save basically any bad mesh and texture combo. Let's look at one of my oldest works that hasn't been completely lost. It's abysmal. I know I throw the word dog shit around a lot, but this is dog shit. Horrible in every way a model like this can even be horrible. But crank the backlighting up, dirty up the frame until you can't see any of the details, and all of a sudden, it's kind of a vibe. Or this Charger 3. I made it before I understood topology, so of course it's awful, and it also has no textures, so all you can see is the really bad mesh. Surely there's no way to make this look decent. Actually, and this I'd say is the benefit of sucking ass at 3D for so many years before figuring it all out. I got really good at presenting things in ways that work around all the flaws and give a compelling final visual anyways. And now that I'm better at 3D, I don't have to hide the details like I used to because I can make a model and texture that look good in and of themselves, but the skills I gained in making good lighting still pay off. And you're gonna hate me, but the best advice I have for this is again, screw around with it. You're gonna need to get a feel for it. Pay attention to things you see in movies, games, even advertisements or whatever. Consider what they do with lighting that makes things pop the way they do. For example, these renders here were directly inspired by the opening for the Barrett-Jackson auctions, just because it's a cool look. Popping back to the Revanchist, one of the most common compliments I get for it is the visuals, particularly the lighting looking really good. And I don't have some deep existential knowledge of color theory and dramatic lighting practices or anything like that. Literally all I do is make a level and think to myself, how do I want it to feel? Sometimes that question already gives me the answer for the light, like this room. I wanted it to feel cold and harsh when I was first planning it out. Cool blue lighting just kind of popped in my head as part of that. For the hallway outside, I wanted it to feel intimidating, heavy, and disorienting, almost maze-like, even though it's just a simple loop. As such, I immediately knew I wanted to put very saturated lighting throughout the hallway so it completely washes out any colors in the environment and blends together all the details to make it harder to spot landmarks or something to get a sense of direction. But I really wanted this room to be impactful. I wanted the change in tone when walking in to hit you like a brick wall. And since I already knew the color of the lighting in there was going to be a cool blue, I made the lights in the hallway a deep orange, since it's complementary. And that's it. It's really that simple. That's about as deep as I ever think about it. Think about your lighting, but don't overthink it. Play around with it. Even to this day, if I'm making a render of something that I made, I'll usually play around and try out a dozen plus different lighting and post-processing setups to find the one I like best. More so than any other part of this process. Screw around with your lighting. Experiment with it. Even if you find something you like, put a pin in it and keep screwing around because maybe you'll find something even better. So now we've got some decent looking 3D art, but this final step is another one that a lot of people skip, and it's probably the most important of all. Scrutiny. Let's take a good up-close look at the Mac, shall we? First of all, since I was just making this to crunch down the PS1 textures, there's a lot of details that are wrong just because I couldn't be bothered to do the research or do them right. It would have taken too long. The grip and sight should have been welded to the receiver. The rear sight should have been more triangular with a smaller hole higher up. The stock doesn't have this section in the middle, it should just be 2 rods. I also didn't model any internals, particularly problematic since this is an open bolt gun. There's tons of other things wrong with it like that, but I'm not going to focus too much on those kinds of things, because they're stylistic choices as much as they're actual flaws. What I'm looking for is things like this. For the stock, I should have added some large-scale wear and paint chipping around these areas. I would have shortened some of the scratches on it too so they don't wrap around like they do, which just looks kind of wrong. These scratches don't look good at all. They're too soft, even, and regular. This clip or whatever on the front looks out of place because it's one of the only parts that wasn't sculpted to rough up the edges. Additionally, this middle part should have been pretty worn down because these would normally have a strap attached that's used to help control recoil. The plastic on the grip looks bad. I've always struggled with this kind of textured plastic, but I'm getting better. I think I put too much emphasis on the edge wear in the diffuse map and should have scaled that back a bit, maybe adding a dirt layer as well in the more occluded spots that's masked to mostly fill in the cavities in the plastic. That probably would have helped as well. The trigger has weird shading where the light kind of wraps around it from the back. This is because the silhouette of the low poly stuck out past where the high poly actually sat. The folded edges at the bottom of the lower should have been a lot softer and rounder. These spots of heavy directional edge wear should have had more depth in the normal map, and it probably would have been a good idea to sculpt these into the high poly to really sell it. Most of the sculpted, worn edges don't look right from up close and receive strange, unsightly lighting. Once again, this is a silhouette issue. I should have beveled these edges a bit more. It wouldn't have added a ton of polygons, but it would have significantly improved the up-close look like this. There's a few spots like this where I've added detail in the high poly that really would have benefited from having some 3D detail in the low poly as well. Many of the scratches have noticeable stepping from being less than 1 pixel wide, and I should have taken some steps to clean that up. There are a few spots where round surfaces have hard edges like this. It's something to do with the way Substance Painter projects its baked maps, since both the low poly mesh and high poly mesh are smoothed here, and it does bake fine in other software. That being said, I should have put in the effort to manually clean this up or splice together multiple bakes in order to minimize the issue in the spots that it does pop up. The logo should have had softer, more minimal edge wear since it's a fairly soft and shallow stamp, and since it's supposed to be folded sheet metal, the lower receiver needs at least one more seam to actually be possible. I don't know exactly where it is on an actual Mac, but logically it would either be here or here. I could have just welded it like I did with this seam. The rail for the sock doesn't actually fit into the receiver and just clips through it, which should always be avoided because it will invariably look like shit. Things need to actually fit together to make them convincing, which is why I added a tapered seam between the upper and lower receivers as well as the grip. On that note, because of the way cage projection works, tight corners like this between separate objects without welded vertices will clip through and make this kind of artifacting. The only fix is using a manually adjusted cage or welding the vertices together on the mesh. The little button to release the stock also has totally screwed up lighting. Again, silhouette issue, the low poly should have had more geometry so it could fit closer to the high poly. The top of the gun was too close to the bolt, which I didn't explode far enough away, so it picked up some of the ambient occlusion and looks like ass. It's an easy fix, but I decided to leave it for the sake of the video. I really should have added some 3D detail to the spring. Right now it's just a cylinder. Adding proper ridges would have been ideal, but even just bending it around a bit can still help sell that it's an actual, fairly stiff spring. I did it in the high poly, looked great, forgot to copy it to the low poly. I could go on, but I'll leave it here. If your thought process hearing me talk about this is, you're being too harsh on yourself, you're nitpicking, it looks great, you really do need to change your mindset. And here are the changes you need to make. Firstly, finding flaws in something doesn't mean it doesn't look good. Just because you made something flawed doesn't mean you can't or shouldn't be proud of what you made. Make no mistake, even with all the flaws I just listed off, I'm still very proud of this. I never thought I could make something of this level of quality. Forget the fact that I made it in like 2/3 the time it took me to make something as simple as this. One last tangent, I promise there's a point. Outside of this, my career for the past few years has been sales management, store manager in particular. One thing that's huge in that line of work is the importance of wording, how you present information. If you're a manager and you want to look good for your boss, don't say flaws or mistakes, say opportunities. It's not, we had a great week for volume, but our UPT was really low. It's, we had a great week for volume, UPT was a big opportunity for us, and we're working on a strategy to maximize it moving forwards. And that's how you should look at your work. Scrutinize the model, the textures, the lighting, the post-processing. You're not looking for flaws, you're finding opportunities. It's not so much what's wrong with this, but more so what can I do better next time? even if you make something terrible. What's important is that you could walk away from it smarter than when you started, and the next thing you make can be measurably better. And that's really how you should measure success with this kind of thing. Don't worry about whether the thing you just made looks good or not. Whether it does or doesn't really doesn't matter at all. What matters is that it's noticeably better than the last thing you made, that you can clearly, visibly see the improvement and articulate exactly what you did differently to make it better. Because I'm going to be honest with you, learning is a skill in and of itself. You need to learn how to learn. Think about things, scrutinize them. If you can do that, you'll be amazed just how fast you can improve. Like myself, I spent years going nowhere in 3D. Everything I made was just as bad as the thing before it. Then I started getting good at learning. Now, everything I make really does look noticeably better than the last. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. Don't avoid trying something in fear that it's the wrong thing to do. Make more mistakes. Most people learn the right way of doing things, then stick to that. They make textures that are technically perfect and realistic because they don't want to make mistakes and do something wrong. They're too scared to start trying something different just to see how it goes and what they can learn. Again, I think that's a big part of why so many modern graphics look so bland. Back in the day, there was no realism, there was no formula. You made things look good through creative and unconventional means. Nowadays, it's a science. It's done. It's figured out. Follow these specific steps, use these specific workflows and those specific values, and here's your technically correct, realistic 3D graphics. And it's up to you to say no. Don't rely on tutorials or even traditional learning material for 3D. Figure it out yourself. Carve your own path forward. Make mistakes that nobody's ever made before so you can gain a perspective that nobody's had before. So go out there and figure it out. Use what you've learned here to make compelling, convincing 3D work that's uniquely yours. And next time some jackass tells you not to multiply your occlusion into your diffuse, you can tell him with a smile on your face to shove it. Moral of the story, this entire video summed up into one soundbite: don't be a pussy and go crying to the internet to hold your hand with tutorials. Nut the fuck up and figure it out for yourself. You'd be surprised what you're capable of. If you want this model, I've got it posted in the Discord, link in the description. Use it as a base to make your own textures. Use what you've learned here in practice. Or whatever, I don't give a fuck, just don't try to sell it. And if the revanche has caught your eye at all, I've got the Steam page in the description. Also, feel free to check out the rest of my channel, because that's what we do here. As always, thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.